Howdy, hi, and hello, everybody. Welcome to Noah's Nest. If you don't know what Noah's Nest is, first of all, hi, I'm Noah. I'll be your host. And in Noah's Nest, there are a couple things that I go over. Either one, a TTRPG I have finally read. Two, a topic that revolves around the fantasy genre, if it's TTRPGs, different video games, maybe movies that involve that kind of genre, or I do a couple different character creations. And today is a very, very special day. I have finally read another TTRPG, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to play Tiny Dungeon. Now, I've done a similar book called Tiny Gunslinger. It is by the same person. It is by Alan Bahar. But this is a more medieval fantasy themed book instead of a Western gunslinger book. So I'll read the back and then I'll go through the actual what's inside. So first of all, this is Tiny Dungeon's second edition. It is the newest iteration of the minimalist fantasy role-playing game. Powered by the Tiny D6 engine with streamlined mechanics that utilize only 1 to 3 single 6-sided dice for every action. Characters that can fit on a 3x5 note card and an easy to understand and teach rules. Tiny Dungeons 2E is a great for all groups, ages, and experience levels. Included are over a dozen lightly detailed settings written by some of the best authors out there. We'll get into those a bit later, but all you have to do is grab some dice, pencils, some friends, and get ready for some minimalist, straightforward fantasy role-playing game. So let's open the book. So for the first couple pages, it'll go by the basic rules. And like it said before, all you really need are 3 D6 dice. But the core mechanic is a test. This is where you roll 2d6 from your dice pool to do a action, a skill, a trait, or whatever. If you roll a 5 or a 6 on any of the dice that you have, you succeed. Some traits that you select during your character creation will give you advantage on certain situations. So instead of rolling them multiple times, you just add a d6, so you'll end up rolling 3 of them to increase your odds of success. If you happen to get disadvantage, you will go down to rolling only 1d6 to resolve a test, an attack, an action, or whatever the dungeon master chooses. There are obstacles, there are save tests, same thing, roll 2d6, 5 or 6, you succeed. During a save test, if you happen to go to 0 hit points, you are technically unconscious. In combat, all players will roll a standard 2d6 test. Any player who is successful on their initiative test takes their actions before opponents. The GM doesn't have to roll. It's kind of just to know when characters are going before you. For traits, and when you are attacking, you roll 2d6. If a trait gives you advantage, you roll 3d6. If you will happen to succeed on an attack roll, depending on what kind of weapon you have, you deal a certain amount of damage. So you'll end up dealing 1 point if you have a light weapon, or 2 points if you have a heavy weapon. And your GM might give you a different amount of points depending on if you have a specific item, magical item, or whatever. They might also give you a bonus on role-playing. there are a couple actions during combat. You could perform a focus or an evade alongside of attacking, moving, or testing an ability. So when you choose to focus, the next time you attack, your test is successful on a 4, 5, or 6. It increases the chance of you succeeding. If you are choosing to evade, until the start of your next turn, you can test a 1d6 when you are successful by hitting an enemy. If you succeed, you evade the attack and take no damage. So, the actions that you can do during combat is evade, focus, test for an ability, attack, or move. There are 3 different kinds of categories of weapons in tiny dungeons. There's light melee, heavy melee, and ranged. You can attack unarmed even if it's an improvised weapon, such as like a bar stool, a rock, or whatever, but they do not classify as weapons. Light melee weapons could be a dagger, a short sword, a hammer, a scythe, something that is short in length. Heavy melee could be a great sword, warhammer, spear, two-handed flail. Think of, two-handed weapons. In ranged weapons, it can require 1 or 2 hands. It could be a sling, crossbow, longbow, throwing knives, or something else that is ranged. Light weapons have to follow these rules. They will only do 1 damage. There are no restrictions on attacks per turn, and light weapons can be held in 1 hand. For heavy weapons, they always do 2 damage. If you make an attack with a heavy weapon, they cannot attack with another weapon, spell, or item that turn. Also, the inverse. If you attack with a different weapon, spell, or item, you can't use a heavy weapon to attack on the same turn. And heavy weapons are always held with 2 hands. Melee weapons have to follow these rules. They may be used to attack something that is close. Ranged weapons have to follow these rules. They may attack something near or far without penalties. And if you end up attacking someone that is a close target, you will suffer disadvantage on the attack roll. And ranged weapons must be reloaded after being fired, which takes an action. And lastly, heavy melee weapons have this rule as well. They can be used to attack something near, but you will suffer disadvantage on the attack. Now you might be wondering, what does close, near, and far mean? Well, those are the different ranges of attacking. So close is within touching distance, within aiding someone. Think of just you're talking to someone face to face. Within that amount of range. You can use a ranged weapon on that, but it'll be at disadvantage. You could also use magic at close range as well. Near is just out of reach, maybe just further away, maybe from one end of the room to the other. You can use an action to move or bring someone near to you, and then a heavy melee weapon can strike someone in this area, but it will still suffer at disadvantage. And then far is anywhere further away than near. It might take 2 actions or more to get closer to an enemy, depending on how far the GM decides. Magic and ranged weapons are the only weapons that can strike enemies from the far range. Still in the basic rules, we'll do hit points next. Hit points in combat, on a successful hit, you'll be dealt with 1 or 2 hit points. Otherwise, the GM decides differently. When you're trying to sleep, to regain those hit points, you have to at least sleep for 6 in-game hours of interrupted sleep to regain your full hit points. If you get any less, you will only regain 1 hit point for every hour of sleep. And when you're asleep, adventurers are unconscious. They don't know what's around them, they're just there. If you are on death's door, if you are dying and you reach 0 hit points, you will not be able to be reduced any lower than 0 hit points. But you would succumb to your wounds and start to die. If you are at 0 and at the start of your turn in combat, you can only make a save test to stabilize yourself. On a success, you come up to 1 hit point and it will end your turn. If you fail, you get one last chance to survive on your own. And at the start of your next turn, you make one more save test, but at disadvantage. If you end up failing, sadly, your adventure has passed. Next is hiding and sneaking. You roll 2d6. If you're successful, you're hidden, or your actions went unnoticed. You can't simply hide in plain sight. You just have to have something that makes sense about covering yourself, concealing, or hiding. Go into like an alleyway or something of the sort. There is magic in the game, but to be a magic user, you have to have a certain trait. By spell reader, spell touched, but it also could be a beast, speaker, familiar, and healer for different magical categories. If you gain those traits. Dungeon Masters can give scrolls, which they could be different effects, like to resurrect a dead ally, transform an enemy to just like a woodland creature, healing everyone all at the same time. These bigger ideas will be on most, if not all, scrolls. There's also a handful of different optional rules that you could implement into your games, such as experiencing character growth. So there's a minimalist advancement where every 3 sessions that you have, you'll gain 1 new trait. You will not be able to have more than 7 traits, but if you ever go past 7 traits, you may swap a non-heritage trait with a completely new one. But there is a different way through experience points. At the end of each session, the GM will award experience, and you may use these experience points to upgrade your adventurer. You can use 6 to permanently increase your HP by 1, 8 to get a new proficiency or mastery in a weapon, or 10, you can completely get a new trait. Depending on how your GM feels, you might get 1 to maybe 3, 4 XP per session. It gives you a rough idea of reasons to give XP, but it's also based on how your GM feels. Now we're finally to character creation. Now, these are completely easy and simple to create for a character, but I'll go through the quote-unquote list that it gives you, and then I'll go through the different heritages. First, you'll select a heritage from the list. You could then next select 3 traits from the trait list. You will then get to select a weapon group to be proficient in, and then you get to choose a specific weapon to master in. You can then select a family trait and then select a belief. In heritages, you will get to gain certain abilities depending on which heritage you get. You'll gain different traits, you'll have different HP. It is different for each trait. Each heritage. So firstly, there's human. Just basic old human. You'll get 6 hit points, and you will get to select an additional trait from the trait list. Next is Fae. Think of like an elf or a fairy or something else of the sort. You will get 6 hit points, and you will also start with the trait Bow Mastery. Bow Mastery is you'll have mastered bows and have advantage on when using them. This addition to the mastered weapon chosen as the adventure creator. So, whenever you choose a weapon proficiency and a mastery, you will also put Bow Mastery. So you'll technically have 2. Next is Dwarf. Those short, stubby ones that live in the rocks and don't fear death. Those ones. You'll get 8 hit points, and you will also gain the trait Dark Vision. You are able to see in total darkness. However, if you are exposed to sudden bursts of light, like spells or flash bombs or whatever, you suffer disadvantage on your next turn. Next is Goblin. You know, those short, very annoying green-skinned schmucks. Well, here you have them. They'll have 4 hit points, and they'll also gain the trait Goblin Agility. Goblin Agility is you contest with a 1d6 whenever you are successfully hit by an enemy. If your test is successful, you evade the attack and do not take damage. Declaring evade as an action has no additional benefits though. Next is Salamar. You might think of like a salamander, like maybe the cousin to the frog, I might say. They will have 5 hit points. And here's the interesting one. You'll get to choose one of the 2 traits, either pyrothermic or cryothermic healing. Pyrothermic is if you would be dealt any damage by a source of natural, non-magical fire damage, it'll actually heal you instead. And cryothermic is the opposite, where if you would be dealt any natural, non-magical cold damage, it will then heal you instead. Next is a tree folk. Those big fucking trees that move. Here you go. You'll get 9 hit points, and your tree folk will have the Ancient Heart trait. It is where you won't be able to be healed by any means other than in direct sunlight and sleep. For each hit point to be healed, you must be in direct sunlight for an hour. It can either be by moving or by stationary, or you can use your sleeping rules. So, no magic. Next is Kahar, I might say. Think of like bear folk. Think of like a polar bear, something that is able to run and walk on all 4s or even stand upright. They usually don't have weapons, but they can also use them as well. They will get 7 hit points, and they will start with the Powerful Claws heritage trait. You will have claws as a mastered weapon, but you will not be able to use ranged weapons. And lastly, for a heritage, you will get the Lizard Folk, where it is the cold-blooded fucks that just hate everyone around them. They will have 6 hit points. They will have the cold-blooded trait, where any attempt to persuade, influence, or manipulate a lizard folk through appeals to emotions or feelings will gain disadvantage to try and persuade them. Now, in this book, there's not that many traits that you can choose from, but there are still a couple pages. You could get Bar Fighter, Blacksmith, Familiar, Martial Artist, Spell Touched, Trap Master. There's quite a few that you can choose, and each of them have different bonuses, from gaining HP to gaining advantage for certain weaponry, or just gaining better stuff, or even being able to cast spells. For weapons, like I said, light melee, heavy melee, and ranged. We already went through the different weapons in each of those settings, or each of those groups, from daggers, short swords, to even a spear, two-handed flail, maybe even shurikens, or even a crossbow. You'll be able to gain items throughout this. There are more additional rules that you can choose if you would like to do so. Now on to GM section. It gives you some background about how to faintly play this in your own way. There is also an enemy charts list where it helps you figure out what the threats are, how much HP they have, and pretty much like a small description of what it'll mainly be like for when your players are trying to fight these enemies. They also give you a fairly good amount of enemies and just a basic idea of what traits and pretty much damage they can deal. So you might get stuff like a fire giant, an eldritch horror, maybe even a unicorn, a zombie, town guard. They all give you different ideas of how much HP they have, some traits that they get, and you might just have to look back and think of what traits they are. There's also a bunch of dinosaurs in this book as well. And this last... oh no, there's more optional rules. Oh geez. So there's more optional rules for prestige traits. Depending on what type of traits you get, you'll be able to prestige them to either get like an animal companion, maybe even be able to heal better, or even be able to cast a lot more spells a lot easier. There's a magical discipline where if you prestige or go through a magical list, you'll get to choose a different school of magic, and it'll help you through that. Same thing with martial disciplines. If you choose martial techniques, you'll be able to choose different disciplines to be able to do more damage or evade a lot better. And lastly, there are more custom options and rules that you can go through if you want, from ships to critical hits to armor reductions to even gaining different mounts and other traits. And lastly, before we get to the last section, is there's an adventuring generator. There are a couple different generators that'll help you have a rough idea. If you have nothing to go off of, this adventure generator will help. So there's 5 different sections. There's verb, subject, place, hindrance, and antagonist. It would pretty much go off of the adventurers must verb, which could be escort, heal, find, lead, whatever. The subject, which could be a wizard, thief, a riddle, animal, lizard folk. In the place, which could also be an ocean, tower, land of dreams, dragon's den. While dealing with a hindrance, which could be a betrayal, thief, kidnapping, gluttony, city watch, and the opposing, the antagonist, which could be politics, thieves guild, necromancer, time, and so much more. Very easy for you to follow, and if you don't like that, if you want to have a more general idea of the setting, they also have, like I said earlier, a bunch of different micro settings by a bunch of different authors. So in these micro settings, they give you just a rough introduction of what this setting could be. It gives you possibly different places, different NPCs, different items possibly, and different enemies that you will end up facing. There's some of them like Home Sweet Dungeon, where you're kind of just going through dungeons, trying to fight enemies. There's Raptor Land, fighting different dinosaurs. There's one called Looking Over the Wall. There's others such as The Savage Seas of Zankar. There's so many different settings. If you want this book and liked what I just talked about, you could check it out on Amazon, DriveThruRPG. You could probably check on Mercari and possibly find it. There's so many places that this book has been and can get. I really do suggest that you end up buying it and supporting Alan Bahar. But I do want to try this at some point because it seems very easy, very quick, no major rules, and you get to create your own character without trying to kill yourself over it. So, that's how to play Tiny Dungeon. If you like this episode and want to check out all of our other stuff, check out everything that we've done in the past couple of years, from different CNC talks to tavern talks that we did for a little bit, to all the other Noah's Nest, and maybe even the one-shots that we've done. You can also check us out on all of our social media. That could be TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Creatures and Cantrips or Creature Cantrip. We also have a Patreon and Buymeacoffee if you want to support us in that way, but you also don't have to support us in that way. You can support us by sharing, liking, commenting, subscribing, or following. All that stuff also helps us grow and gets all of us out there to more of you. And I really do appreciate it. Sorry that I haven't done more of these TTRPG how to play recently. I'm trying to get other stuff ready for the pipeline, and I am going to be moving in like the next month or two, so that's going to be fun. So thank you all for listening. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for joining Noah's Nest. And the very last thing I will say is see you, love you, miss you. Goodbye, guys.